everybody. Great to be here. So I work for the Food Foundation. If you don't know who we are, we do a lot of work to try and influence two key audiences, so policymakers, whether that's at the local authority, devolved government or central government level, and businesses to deliver healthier and more sustainable diets. So we're sort of at the interface really between those of you that generate evidence and the people that need the evidence to make good decisions, and we try and communicate that evidence effectively and in an impactful way to make change happen. So it's great to be here and super exciting to see the scope of the funding call, and I think quite a lot of what I'm going to say really builds on what Guy has set out, hopefully. But what I'm trying to do is, through what I say, articulate some of the policy questions which arise from the challenge that we face. I've pulled these together not as an exhaustive list, but really to kind of illustrate, I think, some of the questions which policymakers and businesses are asking. And I think also, I mean, perhaps one other thing to say is I'm quite centrally involved in the National Food Strategy process, providing independent advice to Henry Dimbleby. And while this is definitely a Food Foundation view, the thoughts are obviously informed to some extent by that process as well. So I've really got a kind of set of policy questions. So this is the one really around externalities. So Guy articulated very clearly the set of externalities that we have, whether it's deforestation, whether it's dental caries for our children and the impact on the NHS of the food that we're eating. There's a set of externalities and a very vibrant debate about how we actually internalise those externalities into the cost of food and whether that is indeed a good thing to do. And of course, at the same time, we have large numbers of people in Britain who are experiencing very low incomes for a multitude of reasons and quite considerable deprivation, and where accessing a healthy diet, whether it's financial access or a range of other barriers that people face, is a problem. So moving to a situation where food is more expensive potentially is really problematic. And I think, so there's a whole set of policy questions here about what are the fiscal measures which you can introduce that might actually try and shift this dynamic, whether it's the case of trying to rebalance the cost of the basket without actually driving up food prices in an overall sense, but actually tipping the balance in favour of the healthier options being cheaper than the unhealthy options, or whether it's using, so the sort of range of policy, whether it might be taxes. We've got on the table for at the moment knocking around a range of options, like in the CMO's report she talks about using VAT, she talks about removing tax relief for spend on advertising of unhealthy foods. There's lots of conversations about whether the sugar tax should be expanded. There's conversations about whether local authorities should be using business rates to try and incentivise healthier offers on the high street. So there's a whole range of different measures, and then there's others that could be considered around, for example, plastic or animal feed or a range of other things that might ultimately tip the balance in favour of us eating healthier and more sustainable food. So what's the right mix of fiscal policies which cost in externalities but don't exacerbate dietary inequalities, I think is a very relevant question for policymakers at the moment. Then there's a set of questions really around the state and the role of the state in actually protecting those most vulnerable in society, protecting everybody, because anything can happen to anyone at any time in that sense, through a basic set of minimums. So we've been doing quite a lot of work on children's food and identifying the areas where children are really falling through the safety net that is intended to be in place to protect them in terms of their diet when they're growing up. But there's lots of holes in that system, and we also don't have a kind of enshrined within law in any way a commitment to ensuring some of those basic minimums. So, you know, we have schemes like the Healthy Start Voucher scheme, which is there in place but doesn't reach that very many people and has very low levels of uptake. We have school food, but there's no monitoring of it, and lots of children who should arguably be entitled to free school meals but are not getting them. And we have this growing challenge of inequalities in obesity outcomes between them. This is from the CMO's report. So this is childhood obesity amongst the poorest decile compared to the least poorest or the richest over time, and that those inequalities are widening. And we've also got challenges around the elderly, elderly malnutrition for a whole cluster of reasons. So I think there's an important set of questions there about what is the role of the state in creating a genuine safety net, and how is that enshrined as a kind of set of political questions about how you enshrine that into legal frameworks and policy frameworks in a way which is meaningful and sustainable. So yeah, how do we enshrine minimum standards or human rights around food into our legal frameworks, and what should they cover? Okay, so now moving on to a set of questions around the social aspect, I suppose. And this is coming up quite a lot in the conversation around the National Food Strategy and how we think about a vision for food which really captures people's imagination and engages citizens from really diverse communities about what we want our food future to be like. And Guy talked a little bit about some of the feedback from the FSA's work, which I think is really, really important here. Eating together is arguably the most sort of communal act that we do, yet many of us are now eating alone. We've got a whole kind of, we've got a whole set of food identity questions about our heritage, questions about multiculturalism, a whole set of questions which could be attached to food, and really be thinking about how do we create a vision for food which gets people excited about engaging in the issues of health and sustainability, but principally getting to those issues through a social lens and the things which excite people about food and get them engaged. And then what's the role of young people actually in helping to shape that vision for food in the future? We know that Greta Thunberg's been sort of incredible in the leadership that she's shown, and I think the scope for involving young people much more deliberately in the process of creating a different food future is really pertinent now, and we need to be really thinking quite seriously about it. So I think the question here is, how do we create a new social vision for food which embeds good health and environmental impacts, and which celebrates our identity and heritage, and which helps to mobilise young people for the future? It's obviously a set of sort of more social science questions, but I think nevertheless quite an important set of questions. And then we come on to the issue of trade, which is obviously hugely important given that half the food that we eat isn't produced in the UK. And I think this is really, really challenging from a policy perspective. I think it's obviously very pertinent also now in the context of Brexit, but there's a set of questions really around how we regulate our trade in a way which means that we're not exporting our environmental and health harms, and what is the global governance arrangements we need in order to be able to actually do that effectively. So this is as much about what we import as what we export, but obviously we're particularly concerned in the context of the scope of this call in terms of what we import. But this is really around trying to think about how we think about the deforestation impacts, the biodiversity impacts, the carbon and water impacts of the food that we're consuming here in the UK, and how, if we're really serious about sorting that out, we really need to probably be looking at this at a global level, and what are the structures that we need in place to properly put in place the right policies to do that. And then this builds on a specific point which, and in fact is the same slide, thanks to Riaz, that Guy presented. This challenge around agriculture and what we grow and agriculture policy, and this disconnect between what we grow and what we should be eating. And I think the key question here is, does what we eat, demand, essentially follow through to what we grow. In other words, you start with changing what we're eating and then producers will follow. Or is there a role for agriculture policy in actually trying to be more deliberate in shaping what we grow to align it better with what we should be eating? And I think that's a very live question. I think if you look at the sort of where we've come from in agriculture policy, we've very much the legacy, and what we're dealing with at the moment is a history of trying to grow more and more and more for less to feed a burgeoning global population. And we're now, seeing the consequences of some of that. And as you know, with the discussions in the UK around the agriculture bill, a very deliberate attempt to move away from supporting farmers to grow stuff to supporting farmers to be environmental stewards of the land. I think what we haven't got then onto is the conversation about, so how do we support farmers to grow a healthier overall basket, and should we? I think it's a very relevant question at the moment, I think. And then, that's the question. Should agriculture policy be aligned with dietary guidelines, and if so, how? Or should demand drive supply instead? And then there's the big old meat question, which is very, very live at the moment in policy terms. You'll have seen different statements by different ministers as to the extent to which ministers are prepared to talk about meat reduction overall. There's a whole set of questions around, if we're moving to a future where we're eating less animal source foods, how much of what are we reducing, how that meat is produced or how that dairy is produced is a vitally important part of that question. To what extent do we, how much meat reduction to align with a net zero outcome? And Eat Lancers has got different projections. There's a whole range of different projections that hit around the direction that we should be going in here. Does meat reduction necessarily mean a healthier basket? We've got the kind of dirty vegan kind of agenda, as it's sometimes referred to. So, vegan food that might not actually be that great for your health. How can we align these things much better? And what's the whole kind of skills, taste agenda around alternatives to meat? So, we're not really going to be able to create a future where we're just simply taking some meat away and putting on some boiled vegetables in their place. It's not going to work. We need to actually be transforming how we're thinking about food preparation. That's massive implications for the restaurant sector, where we're putting plants much more centrally on the plate. But there's a whole series of difficult questions around the pathways to get to where we want to get to, and the policy measures which need to support those transitions. So the question here, what's the role of policy in helping people to move to a future with less animal source foods? Does it have a role? Is it going to happen automatically? So then I just wanted to close with a few thoughts really. We do quite a lot of work with academics in consortia, and have learned a fair bit about, from our perspective, of course, what works and what doesn't work. And I think it's quite easy to see civil society organisations as being a kind of communicator of what you do, the person that can perhaps convene a group of policymakers or a group of other stakeholders and help you deliver the findings from your research. I would say that that's not a particularly effective or meaningful or impactful way of actually working with civil society organisations. I think that there'll be much greater impacts in terms of really making the changes that Guy is talking about if you're thinking about actually defining a case for change through a research agenda, and thinking about why that case for change needs to be made and what it's going to be changing, and do that in partnership with civil society organisations so that you can be really clear that you're going to marshal a range of different types of evidence to be able to explore the case for change and pull it together. That doesn't mean, of course, predefining your outcomes before you've got there, but at least having a sense and then testing whether or not you get to that place through the evidence that you generate. And I think part of this, of course, is remembering that impact is a lot more than dissemination. Impact is really actually about a whole raft of work around influencing and delivery, which is very is a huge step beyond the generation of evidence. And then I think just a few thoughts really on what a good case for change is from the perspective of when you're talking to a policymaker. Obviously new evidence is part of that, but it also needs to be contextualised evidence, part of a broader narrative, so it's not one isolated piece of evidence, but actually you can tell it as part of a story. Stories are really, really important in addition to evidence, case studies, infographics, and using multiple channels to communicate, not just written papers, but really thinking creatively about what are those mix of communication channels. So that's it from me. I've actually unfortunately got to go now because of childcare issues, but my colleague Shona at the back is here if anybody wants to talk further. Shona, stick your hand in the air. That's it. Anyway, we'll talk to us afterwards. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Anna. So the next speaker is a slight change from your programme, but it is somebody from Sainsbury's, and it's Alexa